Some places refuse to let go of the past. Scattered across Arizona's desert are 11 abandoned military bases where soldiers once trained, fought, and died. But the desertion orders never reached everyone. Tonight, you'll discover why night security guards refuse shifts at Williams Air Force Base, what off-roaders hear screaming in the ruins of Camp Hyder, and why families are fleeing homes built on the old Hereford Army Airfield. These aren't legends whispered around campfires. These are the locations, the coordinates, and the encounters that made grown men abandon their posts. If you're ready to walk through the places where America's military dead still stand watch, subscribe to Verified Souls and join our family of fearless truth seekers. Because after tonight, you'll never look at Arizona the same way again. You should have started the hike earlier. The afternoon sun beats down on Apache Pass Road as you lock your car and stare at the trailhead sign marking the 1.5-mile path to Fort Bowie. The parking lot is empty, which surprises you for Saturday, but the heat explains it. It's pushing 102 degrees, and the only movements in the landscape are the shimmer of heat waves rising from the gravel and the lazy circling of a hawk against the pale sky. The trail begins easily enough, winding through desert scrub dotted with prickly pear and ocotillo. You've done your research. Fort Bowie was established in 1862 after the Battle of Apache Pass, served as the center of military operations against Cochise, and later Geronimo's band of Apache warriors, and was finally abandoned in 1894 when the Indian Wars ended. What draws you here isn't just the history but the isolation. The National Park Service has preserved Fort Bowie in a state of elegant decay, accessible only by foot, keeping the site remote and haunting. You want to experience that authenticity, to walk where soldiers walked, to see what they saw. 20 minutes in, you pass the remnants of the Butterfield stage station, its stone walls barely distinguishable from the surrounding rocks. The informational placard is faded, and you have to squint to read it. Your water bottle is already half empty. The heat is different here than you expected. Not just hot, but heavy, pressing down on your shoulders like invisible hands. The silence is absolute except for the crunch of your boots on the trail and your own breathing, which seems too loud. The post cemetery appears on your left, a collection of weathered headstones enclosed by a low stone wall. You leave the main trail to examine it more closely. The graves are a mix of soldiers and civilians, their names eroded by more than a century of wind and sun. Some markers are simple wooden crosses, others are carved stone. You notice several are dated 1886, the year of Geronimo's final surrender. As you're reading one particularly worn inscription, you feel it for the first time. A sensation like the air pressure changing before a storm. A thickness in your chest that makes you pause and look up. The cemetery looks different. You blink hard, attributing it to the heat and glare. But when you open your eyes, the headstones seem newer, their edges sharper, the wood of the crosses less weathered. You step back onto the main trail quickly, telling yourself you need water and shade. The visitor center is still half a mile ahead. The trail descends slightly into a wash, and as you walk, you notice boot prints in the dust that weren't there before. Fresh prints, multiple sets, like a group passed through minutes ago. But you haven't seen anyone since you started. You stop and listen. Nothing. Just heat and silence, and that strange pressure in the air that's building with every step. When you round the next bend, you see Fort Bowie spread out below you. But something is wrong. The ruins shouldn't look like this. According to everything you've read, Fort Bowie is preserved as ruins. Crumbling adobe walls, stone foundations, metal plaques explaining what once stood. What you're seeing now are structures that are more intact than they should be. The adobe walls are too tall, too complete. You can make out the barracks clearly, and what appears to be the commanding officer's Victorian house at the end of the parade ground is not the rubble you expected, but a standing structure with a visible porch. Your vision swims. The heat must be getting to you. You drink more water, but your hands are shaking as you lower the bottle. The landscape itself seems to waver, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, you see both versions simultaneously. The ruins you came to see, and the fort as it was, alive and occupied. The double image makes you dizzy, and you have to sit down on a rock beside the trail. That's when you hear the voices. They're distant but distinct, men shouting commands in cadences that sound wrong for modern hikers. The words are clipped, formal, military. You stand up too quickly, and the world tilts. When it steadies, you're looking at soldiers in Union Army uniforms walking across the parade ground. They're solid, real, sweating in wool uniforms as they carry equipment between buildings. One of them glances in your direction, and his eyes pass over you without seeing, but the expression on his face is one of exhaustion and resignation. You want to run, but your legs won't cooperate. The air is suffocating now, thick as water, and every breath is a conscious effort. You force yourself to walk forward, toward where the visitor center should be, but the trail itself seems uncertain, flickering between the maintained park path and a rougher, older track worn by decades of military boots. Apache Spring appears on your right, and you know this landmark. It was the fort's water source, the reason Fort Bowie was built here in the first place. Historical accounts say Geronimo drank from this spring one last time before being loaded onto a train for Florida in September 1886, taking his last steps on his native land. As you approach the spring, you see him, an old man, 65 years old according to the records, kneeling by the water. His face is deeply lined, his long hair streaked with gray, and there's something in his posture, a weight of defeat that makes your chest ache. He cups his hands, drinks, and looks directly at you. For the first time, you're seen. His eyes are dark and knowing, and in them you see the understanding that this moment, his last moment in his homeland, will repeat forever. He's trapped here, locked in the summer of 1886, drinking from Apache Spring for eternity, while 5,000 soldiers and 500 auxiliaries close in around him. His lips move, but you don't hear words. Instead, you feel the message imprinted directly into your mind. Witness. You're not supposed to be here, not supposed to see this, but now that you have, you're part of it. The pressure in your chest becomes unbearable. You stumble away from the spring, gasping, and the world fractures completely. You're walking through 2 times at once, past the ruins and through the active fort. You see soldiers drilling on the parade ground. You see tourists with cameras. You see supply wagons and rental cars. You see Apache warriors watching from the hills and park rangers giving guided tours. Every moment that ever happened at Fort Bowie is happening simultaneously, and you're caught in the middle of it all, unable to distinguish present from past. The parade ground stretches before you, and you can see the layout of the fort clearly now. The barracks on one side, the row of officers' houses, the corrals and storehouses, the post-trader store, the hospital. More than 50 structures spread out over a large area, not at all like the compact stockade forts from Hollywood westerns. You pass the armory, isolated from the main buildings because of the explosives it contained, and through its doorway you see both stone ruins and stacked ammunition crates. A group of soldiers marches past you, their faces grim. They don't see you, but you see them with terrible clarity. The dust on their boots, the sweat stains on their uniforms, the exhaustion in their eyes. They're returning from patrol, you realize, from chasing Apache raiders through mountains and desert, a futile cycle that will continue until Geronimo's final surrender. But that surrender has already happened. You saw it at the spring, except it's also still coming, still waiting to happen in September 1886. You reach what should be the visitor center, but the building phases between a modern National Park Service structure and something older, maybe the original fort building from 1868, when the Army built the larger permanent installation about 300 yards from the first primitive campsite. The door is both closed and open. You reach for the handle and feel nothing, as if your hand passes through multiple versions of reality at once. The pressure finally breaks. You double over, vision tunneling, and when you can see clearly again, Fort Bowie is ruins. Just ruins. Crumbling adobe walls, melted by time. Stone foundations marking where buildings once stood. Metal plaques with historical information that would have been desperately helpful an hour ago. The parade ground is empty except for desert grass and scattered stones. The soldiers are gone. Geronimo is gone. The spring is just water seeping from rocks. Your phone shows 3 missed hours. You started the hike at 2 p.m. It's now past 5 p.m., though the experience felt like 20 minutes. The visitor center door, the real one, is locked, a sign indicating it closed at 4:30. You're alone at the fort, and the shadows are getting long. The walk back to your car should be simple. Just retrace the 1.5-mile trail. But as you start down the path, you notice things that weren't there before. Boot prints that match the ones you saw earlier. A broken canteen half buried in sand. A brass button stamped with a cavalry insignia. And when you pass the post cemetery, you swear you see fresh dirt on one of the graves dated 1886, as if someone was buried there this morning. You don't run, but you walk faster than the heat should allow. The Butterfield stage station ruins watch you pass. The trail stretches longer than 1.5 miles, or maybe your sense of distance has been irreparably damaged. When you finally reach your car, you sit inside with the doors locked for 10 minutes before you can make your hand steady enough to turn the key. Fort Bowie stands behind you in the desert, ruins under the setting sun. But you know now that it's never truly abandoned. The soldiers are still drilling. Geronimo is still drinking from Apache Spring, taking his last steps on his homeland over and over again. The Apache Wars that ended in 1886 have never really ended. They just continue in a place outside of time, visible only to those unlucky enough to walk the trail when the desert heat and the weight of history collapse into a single, terrible moment. You drive away as the hawk circles overhead, and you don't look back. Some places refuse to let go of their past. Fort Bowie holds its history so tightly that the past bleeds through, trapping anyone who witnesses it in the same eternal loop. If you want to hear about the 10 other abandoned military bases in Arizona where history refuses to die, subscribe to Verified Souls, because some stories need to be told, even when they never truly end. Judson had worked security at Phoenix Mesa Gateway Airport for 3 years, and he'd walked the western perimeter exactly 427 times. He kept count in a notebook he carried in his jacket pocket, a small ritual that helped pass the long hours between midnight and 6 a.m. when the airport was almost completely deserted. The western section was his least favorite part of the route, because it included the old hospital building from when this place had been Williams Air Force Base, back when fighter pilots learned to fly here and sometimes learned to die. Tonight was Thursday, which meant Judson was alone. The other security guard, Davis, had the night off, and the skeleton crew working the cargo operations on the east side might as well have been on another planet. Judson's radio crackled occasionally with static, but mostly it was silent. Just him, his flashlight, and 4,000 acres of former military installation that had trained over 26,500 500ers pilots between 1941 and 1993. The hospital building loomed against the desert sky, 3 stories of Cold War-era architecture that the airport authority kept threatening to renovate or demolish, but never quite got around to addressing. Part of it had been converted into offices that nobody wanted to occupy. The rest stood empty, windows like dark eyes watching Judson as he approached. He'd heard the stories, of course. Every security guard who worked the night shift had heard them. Voices in empty operating rooms, footsteps in sealed corridors, a figure seen near where the burn unit used to be, always a man, always alone. Judson didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in wind making old buildings creak, in desert animals triggering motion sensors, in the way exhaustion and darkness could make the mind see things that weren't there. He'd explained this to Davis once, and Davis had just laughed and said, "Wait until you see him, then you tell me what you believe." The service entrance to the hospital wing was supposed to be locked, but Judson found it standing open. Just slightly, maybe 6 inches, enough to make the darkness inside visible. He stopped, hand moving to his radio out of habit, then remembered Davis wasn't there to respond. The wind, he told himself. The latch was old, probably didn't catch properly. He'd check it, secure it, and move on with his rounds. He pushed the door wider, and the smell hit him immediately. Not the musty, closed-up smell he expected, but something else, something chemical and antiseptic, like a hospital that was still operating. Judson's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a corridor lined with doors. Most were closed, but one at the far end stood open, and from it came a sound that made his skin crawl. Crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet, hopeless sobbing of someone who had been crying for a very long time. "Hello?" Judson's voice echoed down the hallway. "This is airport security. You're in a restricted area." Protocol. He followed protocol because it gave him something to do besides acknowledge the fear crawling up his spine. Nobody answered, but the crying continued, steady and broken and utterly desolate. Judson walked down the corridor, each step measured and deliberate. The doors he passed had small windows, and through them he could see empty rooms stripped of everything except the ghost of what they'd been. A surgical theater with no equipment. A recovery ward with no beds. The hospital had been closed for decades, but the space remembered its purpose. The open door at the end of the hall led to what had been the burn unit. Judson knew this because Davis had told him, had warned him never to go in there after midnight. "That's where it happened," Davis had said. 1947 training accident. AT-6 Texan went down during a night flight exercise. Pilot survived the crash, but not the fire. They brought him here, and he lasted 3 days in that room asking for help the whole time. Asking for someone to make it stop. Judson had laughed it off then. Now, standing in the doorway, he wasn't laughing. The room wasn't empty. A man sat on the floor in the far corner, knees drawn up, face buried in his hands. He wore a flight suit from another era, olive drab and canvas, and when he looked up, Judson's flashlight revealed a face that was wrong in ways that made rational thought difficult. The left side was normal, young, maybe 23 years old. The right side was ruined, skin melted and reformed, eye socket empty, mouth twisted into a permanent grimace of agony. And the smell, that antiseptic smell, was trying to cover something worse, something that smelled like burned meat and aviation fuel. "Help me," the man said. His voice was clear and painfully hopeful, the voice of someone who believed rescue might still be possible. "Please, it hurts so much. Why won't anyone help me?" Judson wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and get out of the hospital, out of the building, away from this thing that couldn't be real, but was. Instead, he found himself kneeling down, keeping distance, but not fleeing. "What's your name?" he asked, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "Second Lieutenant James Whitaker, serial number 00734926, AT-6 Texan, tail number 418763. We were on a night training flight, sir. Engine failure at 800 feet. I got her down, but the fuel tanks ruptured on impact." The words came out in a rush, a report given to a superior officer, the kind of debriefing pilots gave when they survived. "When did this happen, Lieutenant?" Judson already knew the answer, but he needed to hear it. "September 15th, 1947, sir. They brought me here 3 days ago. The doctors say they're doing everything they can, but it still hurts. It still hurts so much. When can I go home? When will someone help me?" The hope in his voice was the worst part. He didn't know. After 78 years, he still didn't know he was dead. Judson felt something break inside his chest. This wasn't like the stories Davis told, wasn't dramatic or terrifying in the way ghost stories were supposed to be. It was just sad, profoundly, unbearably sad. Lieutenant James Whitaker had died in September 1947, probably in this exact room, and some part of him had never left. He was still here, still waiting for help that would never come, still trapped in the worst 3 days of his short life. Lieutenant Whitaker, Judson said carefully, "You crashed your plane. You did everything right. You got the aircraft down and survived the impact. That takes real skill." The burned face tried to smile. "Thank you, sir. My instructor always said I had good instincts. Will he be coming to visit? I'd like to tell him about the landing. I'd like him to know I remembered everything he taught me." "I'm sure he'd be proud," Judson said, throat tight. The records would show Lieutenant Whitaker died at Williams Field in 1947. His instructor would have attended the funeral, would have mourned, would have gone on to train other pilots. He'd been dead himself for probably 40 years. But Lieutenant Whitaker was still here, still 23, still asking when he could go home. "It's so lonely here," Whitaker said quietly. "The nurses used to come, but they stopped. The doctors stopped too. Now it's just me and the pain. Sometimes I think if someone would just sit with me, just talk to me, maybe it wouldn't hurt so much." "Do you think that's true, sir?" Judson checked his watch. He had 4 more hours until his shift ended. He had 427 rounds recorded in his notebook, all of them finished according to schedule. He thought about protocol, about duty, about the rational world where ghosts didn't exist and dead pilots didn't wait for 78 years in abandoned hospital rooms. "Yeah," he said, settling his back against the wall, flashlight pointing at the ceiling to give them both some light. "I think that might be true. I'm Judson. I work security here. You want to tell me about your training? About what it was like to learn to fly?" The hope that flooded Whitaker's face was almost painful to see. "Really? You'll stay?" "For a while," Judson said. "Tell me about your first solo flight." And Lieutenant Whitaker did. He talked about Texas, where he was from, about joining the Army Air Forces because he wanted to see the world, about the first time he pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft respond, felt the ground fall away, and knew he was born to do this. He talked about his girl back home, about the ring he was saving up to buy, about the plans they had for after the war ended. He talked like a young man with his whole life ahead of him, and Judson listened. The crying had stopped. The smell of antiseptic and burned flesh faded to almost nothing. In the flashlight's glow, Whitaker's ruined face looked almost peaceful. Not healed, but at least not suffering quite as much. Judson had read somewhere that some ghosts were residual, just recordings playing over and over. But Whitaker was different. He was aware, present, interactive. He was trapped, yes, but he was still here in some fundamental way. "You know," Whitaker said after a long pause, "I think the pain is less when you're here. When someone listens. Thank you for that." Judson nodded. "I'm here Thursday nights. Same shift every week. I could stop by if you want company." The smile on Whitaker's face was lopsided but genuine. "I'd like that, sir. I'd like that very much. It gets so lonely." When Judson's shift ended at 6 a.m., he left the hospital building with Whitaker still sitting in the corner of the burn unit, still 23, still waiting for a rescue that would never come. Judson logged his rounds in his notebook, 428 total now, and added a small note in the margin. "Thursday nights, burn unit, 1 hour." Davis came back the next night and asked Judson if he'd seen anything. Judson thought about Lieutenant James Whitaker, about a young pilot who died in 1947 and never stopped hoping someone would help him, about the crushing loneliness of being trapped in your worst moment forever. He thought about what it meant that after 78 years, all Whitaker wanted was someone to talk to, someone to remember that he'd been a good pilot, that he'd had plans and dreams and a girl back home. "Yeah," Judson said, "I saw something, and I'm going back next Thursday." Davis studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "He got to you, didn't he? The burned pilot." "His name is Lieutenant James Whitaker," Judson said. "And yeah, he did. Some hauntings aren't about terror. Some are about memory and loneliness and the unbearable weight of being forgotten. Williams Air Force Base trained thousands of pilots who went on to serve their country with honor, but some never left. They're still here, still asking for help, still hoping someone will remember they existed." Lath had been planning this desert camping trip for 3 months, ever since he'd stumbled across the coordinates for Camp Hyder on an abandoned military installations forum. 2 miles south of a nothing town called Hyder, 60 miles east of Yuma, in a stretch of Arizona desert so remote that his GPS had given up trying to find recognizable landmarks an hour ago. This was exactly the kind of place he loved. Forgotten, isolated, and completely off the grid. He set up camp just before sunset, parking his modified Jeep on the hardpan and arranging his tent on the site of what had once been part of General Patton's Desert Training Center. According to his research, Camp Hyder had been built in August 1942 to prepare American soldiers for combat in North Africa. Over 13,000 troops had trained here between 1942 and 1944, learning to fight and survive in desert conditions that mimicked the Sahara. Then in May 1944, the camp closed, the soldiers shipped overseas, and the desert reclaimed what had been temporarily borrowed. Almost nothing remained now. A few concrete foundations, rock walkways that led nowhere, metal posts that might have once held signs or fencing. Lath had passed several weathered warnings about unexploded ordnance on his drive in, reminders that this land had been a live fire training range where soldiers practiced with real ammunition and real explosives. The thought should have made him nervous, but instead it thrilled him. This was authentic history, not some sanitized museum exhibit. The sunset was spectacular, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple. Lath made coffee on his camp stove and watched the light fade, feeling the peace that came with true isolation. No cell signal. No people for miles. Just him and the desert and the ghosts of 13,000 soldiers who had learned to be warriors in this exact spot. The silence was what struck him first. As darkness fell completely, the desert became absolutely quiet. No wind, no animals, no insects. Lath had camped in remote places before, but there was always some sound. Coyotes, owls, even just the whisper of air moving across sand. Here, the silence was so complete it felt physical, like the air itself had frozen solid. He could hear his own heartbeat, the blood moving through his ears. It was unnerving in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He crawled into his tent around 10 p.m., planning to sleep early and explore the remains of the camp at sunrise. The sleeping bag was warm, the air mattress comfortable, and exhaustion from the long drive pulled him quickly toward sleep. That's when he heard the first sound. Footsteps, multiple sets moving in rhythm, boots on hardpan, the distinctive crunch, crunch, crunch of soldiers marching in formation. Lath's eyes snapped open in the darkness. The sound was close, maybe 50 feet from his tent. He held his breath, listening. 20 men at least, maybe more, walking with a military precision, past his campsite. He unzipped his tent slowly, carefully, and peered out into the night. Nothing. Just empty desert under a sky so full of stars it looked artificial. But the footsteps continued, moving away now, heading toward what his map indicated had been the main training grounds. Lath grabbed his flashlight and followed the sound. The beam of his flashlight revealed only sand and scrub brush, no people, no tracks. But the marching continued, steady and inexorable. Lath walked faster, trying to catch up, trying to see who was out here in the middle of nowhere at 10 p.m. The footsteps stayed always just ahead of him, just out of sight, leading him deeper into the former camp. Then they stopped. All at once, complete silence again. Lath stood in the darkness, flashlight sweeping across emptiness, his breathing loud in his own ears. He was about to turn back when he heard the voice. "Company, halt." The command was clear, authoritative, and came from directly in front of him, an officer's voice, trained to carry across distance. "Present arms." Lath spun in a circle, searching for the source. Nothing. Just darkness and silence and the pounding of his heart. He was alone. He had to be alone, but then came the sound of rifles being shouldered, the distinctive click and snap of weapons being presented, dozens of them moving in perfect synchronization. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in an instant. Lath's breath misted in air that had been desert warm seconds before. His flashlight flickered once, twice, then steadied. And in that steadier light, he saw them, not clearly, not solid but present. Ghost images of men in 1940s military uniforms, standing in formation on the parade ground that no longer existed except as a flat stretch of hardpan. Their faces were indistinct, their bodies translucent, but their posture was unmistakably military. They stood at attention, rifles presented, while a phantom officer walked between the rows inspecting them. Lath wanted to run, but his legs had locked. He could only stand and watch as the spectral inspection continued. The officer stopped in front of one soldier, said something Lath couldn't hear, then moved on. This was a residual haunting, Lath's rational mind insisted. Just an echo of the past, a recording playing back through some quirk of atmospheric conditions. The soldiers weren't aware of him. They were just images, nothing more. The officer finished his inspection and returned to the front of the formation. "Company, dismissed." His voice rang clear across the phantom parade ground. The soldiers broke formation and began moving away, their translucent forms walking through the space where barracks had once stood. Lath exhaled shakily and lowered his flashlight. The cold was already fading, the temperature climbing back toward normal desert night levels. He turned to head back to his tent, ready to convince himself he'd experienced some combination of exhaustion and overactive imagination. That's when the artillery started. The first explosion was so loud and so close that Lath dropped his flashlight and covered his ears. The sound was enormous, a physical force that hit him like a wall. He saw the flash, brilliant orange light illuminating the desert for 100 yards in every direction. But there was no crater, no smoke, no evidence of any actual explosion, just sound and light, then darkness again. Another explosion, then another. They came faster now, a full artillery barrage lighting up the night like a thunderstorm. Lath could see the ghost soldiers running, taking positions, responding to the phantom attack. Officers shouted orders he couldn't quite hear over the explosions. Men dropped and crawled, following textbook maneuvers for moving under fire. The sound was unbearable. Lath ran, hands still covering his ears, stumbling over rocks and brush he couldn't see in the strobing darkness between explosions. He had no idea which direction his camp was, no sense of orientation in the chaos. He just ran, primal fear overriding thought. He tripped and went down hard, tasting blood where his lips split against a rock. The explosions continued above him, around him, the sound so intense he thought his eardrums would rupture. He could smell cordite now, the acrid stench of explosives, even though nothing was actually detonating. The ground beneath him vibrated with each phantom impact. Through the chaos, Lath saw them clearly for the first time. The soldiers weren't just images anymore. They were solid, real, three-dimensional men fighting a battle that had ended 80 years ago. They moved with desperate purpose, following orders, executing maneuvers, fighting an enemy that existed only in their eternal loop. Some were hit by the phantom artillery and fell, only to rise again moments later and continue the drill. Death and resurrection, over and over, trapped in an endless training exercise. A soldier ran past Lath so close he could have touched him. The man's face was young, maybe 19, streaked with sweat and dirt. He didn't see Lath. His eyes were fixed on some objective only he could perceive. He threw himself behind cover that didn't exist and opened fire with a rifle at targets that weren't there. The barrage lasted exactly 17 minutes, Lath counted every second, lying flat on the ground with his eyes squeezed shut and his hands pressed against his ears until they ached. 17 minutes of continuous artillery fire that shook the earth and split the night, but left no physical trace. When it finally stopped, the silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. Lath lay there for another 10 minutes before he could convince himself to move. When he finally opened his eyes, the soldiers were gone. The desert was dark and empty and silent once more. His flashlight lay 6 feet away, still working, casting a beam across undisturbed sand. He found his camp by accident, stumbling across it in his disoriented wandering. The jeep sat exactly where he'd left it. His tent was untouched. The camp stove still held lukewarm coffee. Everything was normal, as if the last hour hadn't happened. But Lath's hands were shaking, his lip was bleeding, and his ears rang with phantom echoes. He didn't pack up his gear. He threw everything into the jeep in a chaotic heap and started driving, navigating by starlight and instinct. He'd come back for anything he left behind. He'd buy new equipment if he had to. He just needed to be away from Camp Hyder, away from the ghost soldiers conducting their eternal training. As he drove, the first explosion came again, distant this time behind him, lighting up his rearview mirror. Then another. The barrage had started again, right on schedule. 17 minutes of hell, then silence, then 17 more minutes. Over and over, every night, since May 1944 when the camp closed and the real soldiers left, but the echoes remained. Lath didn't stop driving until he reached Yuma 2 hours later. He parked at a truck stop, hands still trembling, and finally checked his phone now that he had signal again. A message from his girlfriend asking how the camping trip was going. He stared at the screen for a long time before typing a response. He never posted about Camp Hyder on the forum, never shared the coordinates or recommended it as a destination. Some places aren't meant to be visited. Some echoes of the past should be left alone. 13,000 soldiers trained at Camp Hyder between 1942 and 1944, learning to survive artillery barrages and advance under fire. The training ended 80 years ago, but the lessons continue every night, an endless cycle of phantom warfare that never reaches victory or defeat, only repetition. The desert keeps its secrets, and Camp Hyder's secret is that it never truly closed. The exercises continue. The soldiers still train, and anyone foolish enough to camp there becomes an unwilling observer to a war that will never end. You shouldn't have come here alone. That's your first thought as you park your rental car at the edge of what used to be Kingman Army Airfield, now just another stretch of desert on the outskirts of town. You're Ocean, a researcher working on your dissertation about post-war military infrastructure, and Kingman is supposed to be the crown jewel of your thesis. Storage Depot number 41, the place where America melted down its own Air Force. The afternoon sun beats down on the cracked concrete runways that stretch into the distance like ancient highways to nowhere. Between 1945 and 1948, more than 5,383 military aircraft were flown here and systematically destroyed. B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, P-38 Lightnings, P-40 Warhawks. Billions of dollars in aircraft, many fresh from the assembly line, reduced to aluminum ingots in furnaces that ran 24 hours a day. You have the photographs in your research folder. Black and white images showing rows of bombers stretching for 6.5 miles along Route 66. Wings touching, nose to tail, thousands of them covering 5 square miles of desert. In the photos, the aircraft look like a metal forest, an impossible congregation of war machines waiting for death. Now there's nothing, just empty desert, scattered foundations, and the oppressive weight of silence that feels wrong. You expected wind, birds, the normal sounds of an Arizona afternoon. Instead, the air is dead, and the silence presses against your eardrums like water pressure. You check your phone, no signal, which is odd because you had bars just a mile back on the highway. The old control tower stands in the distance, its windows dark and watching. You walk toward it, boots crunching on gravel that shouldn't crunch quite that loudly. The sound echoes, multiplies, until it sounds like 100 people walking in perfect synchronization. You stop. The echoes continue for 3 more steps before fading. That's when you hear the engines. Distant at first, like thunder on the horizon, but growing louder. The sound is wrong for modern aircraft, deeper, rougher, the unmistakable roar of radial engines from another era. You scan the empty sky. Nothing. But the sound continues, building, until you can distinguish individual engines. Not one plane, dozens, maybe hundreds. The temperature drops. In the span of maybe 10 seconds, the afternoon heat vanishes, replaced by a cold that has nothing to do with weather. Your breath mists in the suddenly frigid air. The sound of engines becomes deafening, and you cover your ears, but it doesn't help because the sound isn't coming from outside. It's inside your head, inside your chest, vibrating through your bones. You turn in a slow circle, and the world fractures. The empty desert is gone. In its place, rows upon rows of aircraft materialize like photographs developing in real time. B-17s with their distinctive glass noses and 4 engines. B-24s with their twin tails. Fighters stacked so close together their wings touch. The images flicker, translucent, but becoming more solid with each heartbeat. They stretch to the horizon in every direction. Thousands of them. 7,000, according to your research. All parked here in 1945, waiting to be processed, waiting to die. The phantom aircraft shimmer in the dead air, and you realize with growing horror that you can see through them to the structures beyond. The massive hangars, the processing facilities, the 3 industrial furnaces belching black smoke into a sky that shouldn't have smoke. You try to run back to your car, but your legs feel like they're moving through thick liquid. Each step takes immense effort, and you've only covered maybe 20 feet when the screaming starts. Not human screaming, metal screaming. The sound of aircraft being torn apart. You look back and see it happening. Workers in 1940s clothing move between the ghost planes with terrible purpose. They're as translucent as the aircraft, but their actions are horrifyingly clear. Engines being wrenched from mounts, propellers removed and stacked, wings severed from fuselages, and then the guillotine, a massive blade that comes down on airframes, slicing them into sections with a sound that makes your teeth ache. The sound is everywhere now, inescapable, metal screaming, rivets popping, aluminum shrieking as it's torn and cut and destroyed. These were machines that had ruled the skies, that had won a war, and now they're being systematically murdered. That's the only word your mind can find. Murder. The industrial slaughter of thousands of aircraft that had been alive in the way that machines can be alive. You manage another few steps toward your car, and the stench hits you. Hot metal, aviation fuel, something burning that shouldn't burn. The 3 furnaces in the distance glow with impossible heat, their mouths open like hungry gods, consuming aluminum and steel and the dreams of everyone who flew these planes. The workers are chanting something as they work. You can't make out the words, but the rhythm is mechanical, relentless. They move like automatons, like they've been doing this forever and will continue doing it forever. 35 aircraft per day, your research said. The furnaces could consume 35 aircraft per day, running around the clock. A shadow passes overhead. You look up and see a B-17 flying fortress making its final approach. It's both solid and transparent, real and not real, and you can see the pilot in the cockpit. His face is resigned, accepting. He's flying his aircraft to its execution, and he knows it. The plane touches down on the phantom runway with a sound like thunder, and immediately the ghost workers swarm it. You watch, frozen, as they strip it with practiced efficiency. Equipment removed, engines unbolted, The crew cabin where men had sat and fought and bled and survived, torn open and gutted. The process takes minutes in this accelerated nightmare, and then the fuselage is dragged toward the guillotine. The blade comes down. The sound is worse than anything you've ever heard. Metal screaming in agony, a death cry that vibrates through your entire body. Sections of the once proud bomber fall apart, reduced to pieces, ready for the furnaces, ready to become ingots, ready to stop being an aircraft and become raw material. Another plane lands behind it, and another, and another. They're coming faster now, the approach pattern full of ghostly bombers and fighters all heading to Kingman to die. The sky is thick with them, a constant stream of aircraft that know they're flying to their own destruction but have no choice. Orders are orders, even in death. The cold is unbearable now. You're shaking, teeth chattering, but you can't stop watching. The scale of it is obscene. Everywhere you look, aircraft are being torn apart. The piles of engines grow taller. Mountains of propellers glint in the phantom sunlight. Wings stacked like lumber. Fuselages cut into sections. All of it feeding toward the furnaces that never stop, that consume and consume and consume. You finally reach your car and fumble for the door handle with numb fingers. Behind you, the destruction continues. You can hear every rivet popping, every sheet of aluminum tearing, every engine being wrenched free. The aircraft had names, you remember from your research. Crews had painted them on the noses. Old Black Magic, Mabel's Labels. They had personalities, histories, missions flown, crews saved. And all of it was erased here, melted down, transformed from something with identity into anonymous bricks of metal. Your hands finally grip the door handle, but before you can pull it open, you see the reflection in the car window. A man standing behind you. He wears coveralls and carries a cutting torch. His face is gaunt, exhausted, covered in metal dust and soot. He looks like he hasn't slept in 3 years. He looks like he's been doing this job since 1945 and will never be allowed to stop. "Help us," he says, and his voice sounds like tearing metal. "We can't stop. We've been cutting them up for 77 years, 35 a day, every day. We finish, but they keep coming. They always keep coming. Make it stop. Please make it stop." You spin around, but he's gone. They're all gone. The ghost workers, the phantom aircraft, the furnaces, the mountains of scrap. Just empty desert again, silent and hot under the afternoon sun. But the smell remains. Hot metal and aviation fuel and something burning that shouldn't burn. Your phone has signal again. You check the time and feel your stomach drop. You arrived at 2 p.m. It's now 2 or 4 p.m., 4 minutes. Everything you just experienced happened in 4 minutes. But it felt like hours. It felt like years. It felt like forever. You get in your car and start the engine, hands still shaking. As you pull away, you glance in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, you see them. Rows upon rows of aircraft stretching to the horizon. The ghost of Storage Depot number 41, eternally processing its inventory of 5,183 warbirds. The greatest air force in the world, melted down and reformed, killed and resurrected as ingots. The screaming of metal follows you all the way back to the highway. Even when you can't hear it anymore, you feel it in your bones. You understand now why the local historians you interviewed had that look in their eyes when they talked about the airfield. They'd been here too. They'd seen it too. The eternal recycling of American air power, trapped in a loop of industrial slaughter that never truly ended. You drive faster, putting miles between yourself and Kingman. But you know, you'll never truly leave it. The sound of those engines, those blades, those furnaces, they're part of you now. You witnessed the place where machines go to scream, and you can never unhear it. Storage Depot, number 41, closed in July 1948, its job complete. But completion doesn't mean ending. The work continues in ways the living can't see, shouldn't see. 35 aircraft per day, forever. Some places don't just remember their history. They're condemned to repeat it for eternity. Magdalena had investigated 47 supposedly haunted locations in her 6 years as a paranormal researcher, and Fort Lowell's adobe ruins had been on her list for 3 of those years. 7 miles northeast of downtown Tucson, the crumbling remains of the 1873 cavalry post sat in a neighborhood park, preserved but not restored, slowly melting back into the desert earth from which they'd been formed. She arrived at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday, parking on Fort Lowell Road and walking into the park with her equipment bag slung over one shoulder. The ruins were technically closed after dark, but Magdalena had learned that most historic sites didn't have active security at night. The worst that could happen was a citation for trespassing, and she'd received 3 of those already in her career. The research was worth it. The hospital ruins were her target. According to her historical research, the post hospital had been a 60-foot by 120-foot structure containing 13 rooms and 16 beds, built in 1878 to treat the chronic ailments that plagued frontier soldiers. Malaria had been the primary concern. The original Camp Lowell downtown had been relocated specifically because of mosquito-borne disease along the Santa Cruz River, but the soldiers at the new fort continued to fall ill at alarming rates. The adobe walls of the hospital stood about 6 feet tall now, eroded by 133 years of monsoons and neglect. Magdalena ran her hand along the rough surface, feeling the texture of sand, silt, clay, horse manure, and straw that had been mixed and sunbaked into bricks in 1878. The walls had originally been 20 inches thick. Now they were pockmarked and crumbling, held together more by inertia than structural integrity. She set up her equipment in what had been the main ward: digital voice recorder, EMF meter, thermal imaging camera. Standard ghost hunting tools, though Magdalena had long since stopped believing in Hollywood-style hauntings. What she documented was usually environmental anomalies, psychological phenomena, or occasionally something genuinely unexplainable that didn't fit any neat category. The EMF meter showed normal readings. The temperature was a comfortable 64 degrees, typical for an October night in Tucson. Magdalena activated the voice recorder and began her baseline documentation. Fort Lowell Hospital ruins, October 27th, 11:23 p.m. Clear skies, no wind, ambient temp 64 degrees. Beginning investigation of former main ward area. That's when the smell hit her. Not gradually, not building slowly, but all at once like someone had opened a door. The stench of sickness, sweat and bile and unwashed bodies, and something chemical that her brain identified as carbolic acid, though that made no sense. The smell shouldn't exist here, in open air, in ruins exposed to 133 years of weather. Magdalena checked her thermal camera. The temperature reading had dropped to 58 degrees in the span of maybe 30 seconds. She could see her breath now, misting in air that had been warm moments before. The cold wasn't uniform. It came in waves, pockets of frigid air moving through the ruins like invisible presences. Her skin began to itch. Not surface irritation, but something deeper, internal, like her blood itself was becoming agitated. She recognized the sensation from her research on psychosomatic phenomena, the body responding to psychological stress with physical symptoms. Except she wasn't stressed. She was calm, professional, documenting everything. This was just another investigation. The itching intensified. Magdalena scratched her arm absently and felt heat radiating from her own skin. Fever heat. She checked her forehead with the back of her hand and felt nothing unusual, but the sensation persisted. A growing conviction that her temperature was spiking, that she was burning from the inside. Experiencing unusual physical sensations, she said into the recorder, keeping her voice steady. Feeling of fever onset, though actual body temperature appears normal. Environmental temp continues to drop, now reading 54 degrees. The mist of her breath was thick now, visible even in the darkness. The walls around her began to resolve into something more solid. Not physical walls, she could still see through them to the park beyond, but overlays, ghost images of the hospital as it had been. Beds appeared, 16 of them, arranged in neat rows. Simple iron frames with thin mattresses, most of them occupied by translucent figures of men in various states of illness. Magdalena had seen residual hauntings before, visual echoes of past events replaying like recordings. This felt different. The ghost soldiers in their beds were moving, shifting restlessly, some sitting up to cough, others lying still in positions that suggested unconsciousness or worse. Their faces were indistinct, but their suffering was horribly clear. The fever sensation grew worse. Magdalena's vision began to blur at the edges, and she felt sweat breaking out across her forehead despite the cold. Her hands were shaking. She tried to hold the thermal camera steady but couldn't control the tremor. The EMF meter in her equipment bag was screaming now, registering readings far beyond what should be possible in an open-air location with no electrical sources. A figure materialized beside one of the phantom beds. A man in 1870s medical dress, dark suit, white shirt, spectacles. He moved between the beds with exhausted efficiency, checking pulses, administering quinine from blue glass bottles, making notes in a leather-bound journal. Magdalena's research identified him before her conscious mind could process the information. Dr. Walter Reed, post surgeon at Fort Lowell from 1876 to 1877, who would go on to discover how yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes 20 years later. But Dr. Reed looked nothing like the confident researcher from the history books. This version was haggard, desperate, watching his patients die from a disease he couldn't understand or control. Malaria killed slowly, relapsing and recurring, burning through the garrison month after month. 50 soldiers hospitalized at a time in a fort that housed less than 300 men. The hospital was never empty. Magdalena tried to step back, to create distance from the phantom scene, but her legs wouldn't cooperate properly. The fever sensation had progressed to full-body symptoms, muscle aches, joint pain, the bone-deep exhaustion of serious illness. She sank to her knees on the dirt floor, thermal camera forgotten, trying to remember that this wasn't real, that she wasn't actually sick, but her body didn't believe her mind. Chills racked through her, so violent her teeth chattered. The cold from the environment and the fever heat from within warred in her nervous system, sending contradictory signals that left her disoriented and gasping. She could feel her pulse racing, hammering in her temples and throat. When she touched her own neck to check it, her skin was burning hot. The ghost soldiers began to turn their heads, looking at her, not through her, like residual hauntings should, at her. Their eyes were hollow and knowing, and in them Magdalena saw the recognition of shared suffering. "You're sick too," those eyes said. "You're one of us now. Welcome to the ward." She tried to speak, to tell them she wasn't sick, that this was just psychosomatic response to environmental conditions, but her throat was swollen and raw, her tongue thick and useless. The words came out as barely a whisper. "Not real. This isn't real." One of the soldiers, young, maybe 20, his spectral form translucent but his expression painfully clear, sat up in his bed and looked directly at her. "It's always real," he said, and his voice carried across 147 years, like it was happening right now. "The fever doesn't stop. It never stops. Even after we died, it never stopped." Magdalena's vision tunneled. The edges of her sight went dark, closing in until all she could see was the soldier's face. He was burning with fever, had been burning for a century and a half, trapped in the endless loop of illness that defined his final days. Malaria didn't kill quickly. It destroyed slowly, relapsing and recurring, burning and chilling, until the body finally gave up from exhaustion. She felt herself falling, unable to hold her kneeling position. The ground rushed up but seemed to take forever to reach. In that stretched moment, she experienced something that couldn't be explained by environmental factors or psychological suggestion. She felt every fever that had burned through this hospital. Every soldier who had lain in those 16 beds, sweating and shaking and begging for water. Every death from malaria, from dysentery, from the dozens of diseases that killed more frontier soldiers than combat ever did. The weight of their sickness crushed down on her, centuries of suffering compressed into seconds. She understood with terrible clarity why this place was haunted. Not because of violence or trauma, but because of the grinding, relentless misery of illness. The hospital had been a place of slow death, and that death had soaked into the adobe walls, into the ground, into the very air. Magdalena hit the dirt floor, and the connection broke. The cold vanished instantly, replaced by normal October warmth. The fever sensation drained away, leaving her weak and shaking but clear-headed. The ghost soldiers, Dr. Reed, the phantom beds, all of it vanished as if it had never been. She lay on her side in the ruins, breathing hard, staring at the modern park lights visible through the eroded walls. Her equipment was still running. She could hear the faint beep of the EMF meter, now reading normal levels. The voice recorder's red light blinked steadily. Her thermal camera lay 3 feet away, where she'd dropped it. Everything was documented, though she already knew the recordings would show nothing useful. They never did when the experience was this visceral. She forced herself to sit up, taking inventory. No fever. Her forehead was cool and dry. No muscle aches, no chills, no symptoms of any kind. Her pulse was elevated but slowing. Whatever she'd experienced had left no physical trace, which somehow made it worse. There was no rational explanation for phantom symptoms, no environmental factor that could cause such specific and intense sensations. Magdalena gathered her equipment with shaking hands and left the hospital ruins. Behind her, the adobe walls stood silent and empty, slowly melting back into the earth. But she knew the soldiers were still there, still lying in their phantom beds, still burning with fever that would never break. The hospital had closed in 1891, but the suffering hadn't ended. It just continued in a frequency the living usually couldn't perceive. She walked back to her car and sat for 20 minutes before she could make herself turn the key. Her research notes would record this as an inconclusive investigation. Interesting personal experiences, but no documented evidence of paranormal activity. The truth was more complicated. Fort Lowell wasn't haunted by ghosts in any traditional sense. It was haunted by disease itself, by the memory of illness soaked so deeply into the location that sensitive people could still feel it 133 years later. Magdalena drove home and slept for 14 hours, her body recovering from symptoms of an illness she'd never actually had. When she woke, she deleted Fort Lowell from her list of sites to investigate. Some places didn't need documentation. Some hauntings were better left alone. The soldiers would continue their endless fever dreams, whether anyone witnessed them or not. Trapped in the hospital that couldn't heal them, burning forever in the ruins of their own suffering. You shouldn't be testing at night, but the deadline doesn't care about your preferences. The new electric prototype needs validation, runs on the 5-mile oval before the engineers present to corporate next week, which means you're at the Chrysler Arizona Proving Ground at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, the only living soul on 3,840 acres of desert test facility. Your name is Landon, and you've been a test driver for 4 years. You know every inch of this place, the high-speed oval, the low-friction pads, the 18-acre dynamics area. You know the facility was built on the bones of WWII Army Airfield, a World War II gunnery training school where pilots learned to shoot from moving aircraft. The runways are still here, incorporated into the Proving Grounds road network. Sometimes when you're doing high-speed runs, you can see the old taxiways branching off into nowhere. The prototype purrs as you accelerate onto the oval. Electric motors don't roar like combustion engines. They whine, a rising pitch that sounds almost alive. You push it to 80, then 100, then 120 miles per hour. The banked curves of the oval feel smooth, perfect, engineered for exactly this purpose. Your radio crackles with static, but nothing else. The control tower, the original 1943 tower still in use, is dark except for a single light in the observation deck, where the night supervisor is probably drinking coffee and watching monitors. At 140 miles per hour, you hear the first engine. Not your electric whine, but something else. A deeper sound, mechanical and angry, the distinctive roar of a radial engine from another era. You ease off the accelerator instinctively, eyes scanning the night sky through the windshield. Nothing. Just darkness and stars, and the empty desert beyond the track's perimeter. The sound grows louder. You slow to 90, then 60, trying to identify the direction. It's coming from above and behind, moving fast. Your mirrors show only empty road and darkness, but the engine noise is unmistakable now. A World War II fighter, maybe a P-39 Airacobra or P-63 King Cobra, the kind of aircraft they used as targets at the gunnery school, flying past while student gunners practiced their aim from bombers. You pull off the oval onto one of the auxiliary roads, killing your lights. The engine sound passes directly overhead, so low and so loud that your car's frame vibrates. You crane your neck to look up through the windshield and see it for just a moment. A fighter aircraft, translucent but visible, screaming past at maybe 300 miles per hour. The sound Doppler shifts as it passes, then begins to circle back. This is impossible. You know this intellectually, but your body knows something else. That sound means danger, means something fast and violent, and angry is coming for you. You restart your engine and accelerate back onto the oval. Some primal instinct telling you to move, to not be a stationary target. The fighter makes another pass, closer this time. You can see the tracers now, phantom bullets that light up the darkness in streams of orange and white, stitching across the road behind you. They're not real, can't be real, but the sound of them impacts the pavement like sledgehammers. Your rational mind screams that you're hallucinating, that exhaustion and isolation are creating sensory hallucinations. Your survival instinct doesn't care about rational explanations. You floor the accelerator. The electric prototype responds instantly, no lag, pushing you back into the seat as it climbs toward 160. The fighter banks and comes around for another run. This time you see the pilot, a translucent figure in a 1940s flight suit and oxygen mask, hunched over the controls, every line of his body radiating desperation and rage. The tracers come closer. One stream passes directly over your car, so close you can hear the rounds even though they're not physically there. The sound is deafening, a sustained burst of machine gun fire that makes your teeth ache. You swerve instinctively, nearly losing control at 160 miles per hour on a banked curve. More engines. Not one now, but 3, 4, 5. A whole squadron of phantom fighters materializing out of the darkness, circling the oval like predators around prey. They take turns diving on you, each pass bringing those streams of tracer fire closer. The sound is constant now, overlapping bursts of machine gun fire creating a wall of noise that makes thought impossible. You realize with sudden, terrible clarity what you're experiencing. The flexible gunnery school at Yucca trained aerial gunners by having them shoot at target aircraft, real planes with real pilots flying them. The pilots would fly predictable patterns while student gunners tried to hit them, using special fragmentation bullets that would damage but theoretically not destroy the target planes. But accidents happened. Collisions. Live ammunition loaded by mistake. Pilots who didn't return from training runs. These are the ones who died. The target pilots who went down during training, killed by friendly fire, by mechanical failure, by bad luck and bad timing. They're still flying their patterns, still making their runs, still being shot at by ghostly gunners who can't stop pulling triggers that don't exist anymore. A P-39 comes in so low you can see the individual panels on its fuselage. The tracers from its guns. No, not its guns, but the guns of Phantom bombers firing at it from some unseen position pass through your windshield. You feel the pressure of their passage, a wave of heat and violence that shouldn't register if they're not physical. Your steering wheel jerks in your hands as if something impacted your car, but there's no damage, no broken glass, just the memory of violence written into this place so deeply that it can still be felt. You're doing 180 now, faster than the prototype has ever been tested, faster than it's rated for. The electric motors are screaming, the battery system flashing warnings on your dashboard, but you can't slow down because the fighters are matching your speed, circling tighter, diving more frequently. The pilot faces you can see now are young, so young, late teens or early 20s, frozen forever in the moment they failed to complete one more training run. One of them is different. A P-63 that flies alongside you instead of diving on you, matching your speed exactly. You risk a glance to the side and see the pilot looking directly at you. His mouth is moving, saying something you can't hear over the engine noise and gunfire. His expression isn't rage or desperation, it's pleading. He's asking for something, begging for it. Help us. The words don't come through your ears, but directly into your mind, bypassing sound entirely. We can't stop. We've been flying these patterns since 1944. Every night, every target run, every practice mission. They keep shooting at us and we keep dying, and we can't stop. Make it stop. Please make it stop. The P-63 peels away into a climbing turn, and you see it happen in real time, in horrible slow motion. A bomber appears. A B-17 Flying Fortress, ghost translucent but solid enough to matter, and from its waist gun positions come streams of tracer fire. They intersect with the P-63's flight path. The fighter shudders, pieces of its cowling and wing tearing away. It begins to roll, losing control, heading for the desert floor. The impact lights up the night. Orange fireball, black smoke. The fighter disintegrating on impact. You can hear the pilot screaming, a sound of pure agony that cuts through all the engine noise and gunfire. Then nothing. The wreckage vanishes. And 30 seconds later, the P-63 appears again, whole and undamaged, beginning another circuit of the oval, ready to die again. You realize you're crying. Tears streaming down your face, hands locked on the steering wheel, foot still pressing the accelerator to the floor. The prototype is doing 195 now, well beyond safe testing parameters. But you can't make yourself slow down, because slowing down means being an easier target. And some part of your brain has fully accepted that the Phantom tracers can hurt you, can kill you, can trap you here with the dead pilots flying their eternal training missions. The oval's entrance appears ahead, your chance to exit, to get off this nightmare circuit. You take it without slowing, tires screaming in protest as you corner at 160. The fighters follow for a moment, then peel away one by one, returning to their patrol patterns. The sound of engines and gunfire fades but doesn't disappear. It's still there, just quieter, a background radiation of violence that saturates this place. You don't stop driving until you reach the proving ground's main gate 5 miles away. The security guard on duty takes one look at your face and asks if you're okay. You try to answer but can't form words. He calls your supervisor. Someone drives you home. The prototype gets towed back to the garage with its battery system completely drained and several warning systems fried from the extreme high-speed run. You don't go back to work for a week. When you finally return, you request to be assigned to daytime testing only. Your supervisor agrees without asking for explanation. He's been at Chrysler for 20 years, worked there when it was still the Ford Proving Ground. And there's something in his eyes that says he understands exactly why you're making this request. The flexible gunnery school at Kingman Army Airfield closed in 1945. The training missions ended, the pilots went home or went to war, and the aircraft were decommissioned. But some missions never complete. Some target runs continue forever, played out every night in the darkness above runways that now test automobiles instead of weapons. The pilots are still up there, still making their patterns, still dying over and over in training accidents that killed them 80 years ago. You never test at night again. Some deadlines aren't worth meeting. Some places have memories too violent to ignore. And some ghosts aren't trapped by chains or unfinished business. They're trapped by muscle memory, by training so ingrained it continues past death. Flying, diving, being shot at, dying, respawning, and doing it all again, forever. Mercy had convinced herself the house was a good deal. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, updated kitchen, large backyard, and priced $20,000 below market value in a neighborhood where everything sold within days. The real estate agent had explained the low price as motivated sellers, nothing more. She hadn't mentioned that the subdivision was built on the concrete apron of Hereford Army Airfield, where pilots had practiced night bombing runs in B-26 Marauders during World War II. The first week was perfect. Mercy, her husband Devin, and their 7-year-old daughter Kaya settled into the rhythm of their new home. The neighborhood was quiet, the schools were good, and the commute to Sierra Vista was manageable. Devin set up his home office in the spare bedroom. Kaya claimed the room with the west-facing window. Mercy started planning the garden she'd plant in the spring. The engine started on night 8. Mercy woke at 2:17 a.m. to a sound that didn't belong, a deep, throaty roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. She lay in the darkness, listening, trying to identify it. Not a car. Not a plane from the nearby airport. Something older, mechanical, powerful. The sound built to a crescendo, then faded as if passing overhead. She checked the window. The street was empty, houses dark, nothing moving. The sound was gone. Probably a large truck on the highway, she told herself, though Highway 92 was 2 miles away. She went back to sleep. The second night, it happened again. Same time, 2:17 a.m. Same sound, that thunderous engine roar building and fading. This time, Devin woke too. "What is that?" he mumbled, half asleep. "I don't know. Go back to sleep." But she lay awake for another hour, listening for it to return. It didn't. By the 4th night, Mercy was dreading bedtime. She knew it would come at 2:17 a.m. The anticipation kept her from deep sleep, floating in that liminal space between waking and dreaming. When the engine started, and they always started, she was already conscious, already waiting. Devin slept through it now. Somehow, he could sleep through anything. On night 7, Kaya appeared in their bedroom doorway. "Mommy, there's planes outside." Her voice was small, frightened. "They're really loud." Mercy got up and walked her daughter back to bed. Through Kaya's west-facing window, she could see nothing but darkness and the distant lights of other houses. But the engine sound was undeniable, louder here than in the master bedroom. It wasn't one engine now, but multiple, a formation of aircraft passing over the house, except there were no aircraft. The sky was empty. "It's just noise carrying from the airport," Mercy said, tucking Kaya back in. "It'll stop soon." But it didn't stop. It continued for 17 minutes. Mercy counted every one, before finally fading. Kaya clung to her mother until silence returned, then fell asleep. Mercy didn't. She started researching the next day. Google search for the address turned up property records, tax information, and a 1944 aerial photograph. The photograph showed Hereford Army Airfield in full operation. 3 long runways forming a triangle, taxiways, dozens of buildings, and a large concrete apron where aircraft were parked. Their house, according to the overlay, sat directly on what had been that apron, where B-26 Marauders and B-25 Mitchells had parked between training missions. The B-26 had a reputation. Widowmaker, pilots called it. Fast but unforgiving, with a landing speed of 130 miles per hour and engines that could flame out with little warning. Training accidents were common. Mercy found casualty lists, crash reports, investigations into why so many crews died learning to fly an aircraft that killed before they ever reached combat. Night 10 brought the dreams. Not Mercy's dreams, Kaya's. The 7-year-old woke screaming at 2:17 a.m., thrashing in her bed, eyes open but unseeing. "We're going down. We're going down. Pull up. Pull up." Her voice wasn't her own. It was deeper, adult, male, thick with terror. Mercy and Devin ran to her room. Kaya's eyes were rolled back, showing whites, her body rigid with fear. She was asleep but experiencing something so vivid it possessed her completely. Devin tried to wake her, shaking her shoulders, calling her name. She didn't respond, just kept screaming. "The engine's out. Number 2's out. We can't make the field. We're not going to make it." It lasted 8 minutes. Then Kaya went limp, breathing normally, sleeping peacefully, as if nothing had happened. In the morning, she remembered nothing. Just a vague sense of falling, of being scared, of someone yelling. She ate her cereal and asked if she could play outside after school. Devin wanted to call a doctor. Mercy said no, not yet. Let's see if it happens again. She knew it would happen again. She knew with absolute certainty that something in this house, on this land, was replaying bomber training missions every night at 2:17 a.m., and now it was getting inside Kaya's head. Night 11. Kaya's dreams came again, different details this time. "Fire in the cockpit, can't see through the smoke, need to bail out. Where's the crew? Where's my crew?" Devin held their daughter while she screamed words a 7-year-old shouldn't know, experiencing the death of someone else, some pilot who crashed at Hereford Army Airfield 80 years ago. Night 12. Mercy dreamed. She was in the cockpit of a B-26, instruments glowing faintly in the darkness, the twin engines thundering outside the thin aluminum skin. The pilot beside her was young, maybe 23, his hand steady on the yoke despite the fear in his eyes. They were on a night training mission, practicing approaches, and something was wrong. She could feel it in the aircraft's handling, the way it pulled left, the sluggish response to control inputs. "Tower, this is Able 6. We have engine trouble. Request emergency landing clearance." The pilot's voice was calm, but his knuckles were white. The tower responded with static and coordinates. They were lined up on the runway, that 9,200-foot strip of concrete that was supposed to be long enough for anything, but the aircraft was sinking too fast, approaching too steep. Mercy felt the impact, felt the nose gear collapse, felt the aircraft cartwheel, metal, tearing, the world rotating in sickening somersaults, felt the fuel ignite, felt the heat, felt herself burning. Then she woke in her own bed, screaming, Devin shaking her, asking, "What's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong?" Night 13. Both Mercy and Kaya dreamed. Same crash, same crew, same moment of impact. They woke simultaneously, mother and daughter, screaming together at 2:23 a.m. Devin tried to comfort them both. But how do you comfort someone reliving another person's death? How do you explain that the ground beneath their house remembers violence, remembers young men learning to fly machines that killed them before they ever saw combat? Devin didn't dream. He slept through everything, waking only when his wife and daughter screamed. During the day, he suggested they were feeding each other's anxiety, creating a feedback loop. At night, alone with his peaceful sleep, he didn't experience what they experienced. The dreams weren't coming for him. By night 15, Mercy wasn't sleeping at all. She sat up until 2:17 a.m., drinking coffee, reading, doing anything to avoid being asleep when the engine started. But exhaustion caught her eventually, dragging her under despite the caffeine. And the dreams were waiting. Different crashes now, different crews. A catalog of training accidents, each one experienced from inside the cockpit, each one ending in fire or impact or the terrible moment when the pilot realizes they're not going to make it. Kaya's grades started slipping. She fell asleep in class. The school counselor called, concerned about dark circles under her eyes, about how she flinched at loud noises. Mercy tried to explain about the house, about the engines, about the dreams. The counselor recommended a child psychologist. Devin made the appointment. Night 18 brought Devin into the cycle. He woke at 2:17 a.m. not to sounds or screams, but to his own dream. He was the bombardier in a B-25, watching through the Norden bomb site as the practice range approached, except something was wrong with the approach angle. They were too low. The pilot was fighting the controls. Someone was screaming about hydraulic failure. The ground rushed up, and Devin experienced his first crash, his first death, his first glimpse of what his wife and daughter had been experiencing for over a week. He emerged from the dream, white-faced and shaking. "We need to leave," he said. "We need to leave this house right now." They packed essentials at 3 a.m. and drove to a hotel. Left the house with lights on and doors locked, fled like refugees from something they couldn't name. In the hotel room, blessed silence. No engines, no dreams. All three of them slept until noon, the first real rest in days. But the mortgage didn't care about phantom bombers. The bills didn't acknowledge training accidents from 1943. They couldn't afford to abandon the house, couldn't sell it fast enough to matter. After 3 nights in hotels, they went back to the house built on the concrete apron, back to 2:17 a.m., back to the dreams. The pattern continued. Every night the engines, every night the dreams. Different crashes, different crews, but always the same outcome. Young men dying in training, their final moments imprinted so deeply into this place that the land itself dreamed their deaths on eternal repeat. The concrete apron where they'd parked their bombers between missions had become a memorial made of nightmares. Mercy stopped trying to fight it. She accepted that sleep meant dreaming, meant dying. She started keeping a journal, documenting each crash, each crew member's name when she could catch them, each detail of the training accidents. Maybe someone needed to remember. Maybe that was the point. The pilots had died learning to fly missions they never got to complete, and nobody remembered them except the ground where they'd fallen. By week 6, all 3 family members had experienced at least 20 different crashes. They recognized individual pilots now could anticipate certain malfunctions. The B-26 with the sticky throttle, the B-25 with the faulty fuel gauge, the night trainer whose electrical system failed at the worst possible moment. These weren't random nightmares. They were recorded history playing back through the dreams of anyone unlucky enough to sleep where the concrete apron once stood. Other families in the neighborhood didn't seem affected. Mercy asked carefully, obliquely, but nobody else reported engine sounds or dreams. Maybe it was just their house. Maybe it was just their lot. Maybe they'd bought the exact spot where the worst crashes had occurred, where the most deaths had happened, where the trauma was deepest. They learned to function on 4 hours of sleep, learned to live with the certainty that 2:17 a.m. would bring engines and dreams, and the visceral experience of dying in a training accident. Learned that Hereford Army Airfield had closed in 1945 but never truly ended, that specialized night training and B-26 Marauders continued in a frequency only the sleeping could perceive. Learned that some ground doesn't forget what's soaked into it, and concrete is an excellent recorder of violence. The house was still a good deal, $20,000 below market value. Now, Mercy understood why. Vihan had worked maintenance at Bisbee Douglas International Airport for 11 months when he found the sealed section. The airport's oldest hangar, a massive structure from 1942 when this place had been Douglas Army Airfield, was being renovated to accommodate a new tenant, and someone needed to map the building's interior layout for the contractors. Vihan drew the short straw. The hangar's main floor was straightforward, just empty space where B-25 Mitchell bombers had once been serviced between training flights, but the architectural plans showed a second level that shouldn't exist. Not offices or storage, but living quarters. Barracks built into the hangar structure itself, probably for mechanics or ground crew who needed to be near the aircraft around the clock. Vihan found the access stairway behind a wall of plywood that looked like it had been installed decades ago. The plywood was painted the same industrial beige as everything else, blending seamlessly, easy to miss if you weren't specifically looking. He pried it off with a crowbar, revealing a metal door marked Quarters B7, Authorized Personnel Only. The stenciled letters were faded but readable, painted sometime in the 1940s, and never refreshed. The door wasn't locked, just stuck. Vihan put his shoulder into it and felt it give with a groan of metal on metal. The smell that rolled out made him step back. Not decay exactly, but stagnation. Air that hadn't moved in 80 years, thick with dust and something else. Something sour, like fear, sweat dried into fabric and left to petrify. He clicked on his flashlight and climbed the stairs. They were steep and narrow, designed for function rather than comfort. At the top, a corridor stretched away into darkness, doors on both sides. The overhead lights were old fixtures, bulbs long dead. His flashlight beam caught details that made his skin crawl. Personal items still in place, as if the occupants had left intending to return. A jacket hanging on a hook, boots lined up outside a door. A photograph tacked to a bulletin board showing young men in flight suits grinning at the camera. Vihan walked down the corridor slowly, checking each room. They were small, maybe 10 feet by 12, with 2 bunks per room. The mattresses were gone, stripped away when the base closed in 1945, but the metal frames remained. And in some rooms, other things remained too. Letters on improvised desks, playing cards scattered on floors, a rosary hanging from a bedpost. These pilots had lived here while learning to fly B-25s, had slept here between training flights, had left pieces of themselves behind when they finally got their orders and shipped out. The shadow appeared in room B714. Vihan was documenting the dimensions when his peripheral vision caught movement. Just a flicker, a darker patch of darkness in the corner. He turned his flashlight toward it and saw nothing. But when he looked away, it was there again, watching, waiting. His rational mind said it was just shadows playing tricks, the flashlight beam moving, creating illusions. But the animal part of his brain, the part that still remembered when humans were prey, was screaming at him to live. He forced himself to finish measuring the room, writing down numbers with hands that shook slightly. Professional. He was a professional. This was just an old building. The shadow moved between him and the door. Not walking, moving, flowing like liquid darkness, thick and viscous. Vihan's flashlight beam hit it directly and revealed nothing. The light passed through where the shadow should be, illuminating the wall beyond, but his eyes still saw it, still tracked its movement as it shifted and coalesced into something roughly human-shaped. Vihan backed toward the window, keeping his flashlight pointed at the shadow that wasn't affected by light. "Hello?" His voice came out smaller than intended. "Is someone there?" Stupid question. Obviously, something was there, even if it wasn't someone. The shadow didn't respond. It just grew larger, spreading across the walls and ceiling like spilled ink. Vihan could see the room beyond it, the walls, the bunks, the window. But he could also see the darkness, existing in the same space simultaneously. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the span of heartbeats. His breath misted, and the smell intensified, that sour fear sweat smell, now mixed with something metallic. Blood and terror. More shadows appeared, flowing out of the walls, rising from the floors, condensing from the stagnant air itself. They had shapes now, vaguely human, but wrong. Proportions distorted, limbs too long, heads tilted at angles that shouldn't be possible. Vihan counted 7, then 10, then lost count as they multiplied, filling the small room with writhing darkness. He bolted for the door. The shadows didn't try to stop him, but they moved with him, following like smoke drawn by a draft. He ran down the corridor, flashlight beam bouncing crazily, revealing more shadows emerging from every room. They poured into the hallway, a tide of living darkness that flowed after him with terrible purpose. The stairway seemed twice as long descending. Vihan took the steps 3 at a time, nearly falling, catching himself on the railing. Behind him, the shadows filled the stairwell top to bottom, a column of darkness descending like floodwater. He could hear them now, not footsteps or breathing, but a sound like static, like white noise. Like 1,000 whispered voices, all talking at once in a language that predated words. He burst through the door at the bottom and slammed it shut behind him. The metal door should have felt substantial, protective. Instead, it felt flimsy, inadequate against what was on the other side. Vihan stood there gasping, one hand on the door, feeling vibrations through the metal. Something was pressing against it from inside. Many somethings. Testing. The barrier. His phone rang, making him jump. The airport supervisor, asking about progress on the hangar survey. Vihan tried to answer normally, but his voice shook. Found the second level. Old barracks. I need to come back with better lighting. Not a lie, exactly. Just not the whole truth. He left the hangar, stepping out into afternoon sunshine that felt like salvation. The heat of the Arizona desert was a blessing after the cold of that corridor. Vihan sat in his truck for 20 minutes, hands still shaking, trying to process what he'd experienced. Shadows that moved independently of light. Darkness with intent. It was impossible. It had to be impossible, but he'd seen it, felt it, smelled it. Douglas Army Airfield had trained thousands of pilots between 1942 and 1945, young men learning to fly bombers that would carry them into combat. The base had been a place of intense stress, of fear barely contained beneath military discipline. Boys pretending to be men, knowing that every training flight brought them closer to the day they'd fly for real, when the anti-aircraft fire wouldn't be simulated, and crashes wouldn't be survivable. That fear had to go somewhere. Vihan understood this with sudden clarity. Emotional energy doesn't just dissipate. In a place where thousands of people were terrified for months at a time, where boys lay in bunks at night wondering if they'd survive the war, where every training accident was a preview of what awaited them overseas, all that fear soaked into the walls, into the floors, into the air itself, and eventually it took form. The shadows weren't ghosts of dead pilots. They were the fear itself, given shape and substance after marinating in that sealed barracks for 80 years. Fear of death, fear of failure, fear of the enemy, fear of letting down their crew. Fear so concentrated it had become a thing, multiple things, entities born from collective terror. Vihan returned to the airport office and filed his report. He described the second level accurately. Dimensions, number of rooms, structural condition. He did not mention the shadows. Did not mention the cold, or the smell, or the sensation of being watched by something that predated and transcended human understanding. The contractors would go in next week with their lights and equipment, and maybe the shadows would retreat. Maybe daylight and noise would dilute them, drive them back into the walls. But 3 days later, one of the contractors called in sick, then another. Then the whole crew refused to work in that hangar, citing bad vibes and weird feelings. The project manager tried to push them, citing deadlines and penalties, but they wouldn't budge. Too uncomfortable, too wrong. Something about that building made grown men's skin crawl even with all the lights on and people around. The renovation stalled. The hangar remained empty except for the sealed barracks on the second level. And at night, when Vihan worked, late shifts, he sometimes saw darkness moving in the hangar's high windows. Shadows that shouldn't exist, flowing back and forth, as if pacing, as if waiting for someone else to open that door and let them out. He never went back to the second level, never finished his survey. Eventually, they assigned the project to someone else, a new guy who didn't know the hangar's history. Vihan tried to warn him, obliquely, carefully. That second level is weird. Maybe just do the ground floor. The new guy laughed it off. Vihan didn't push. Some lessons have to be learned firsthand. Douglas Army Airfield had closed in 1945, its mission complete, its pilots dispersed to combat theaters or civilian life. But the fear they'd left behind had never dispersed. It had concentrated, condensed, transformed into something that existed in the spaces between light and shadow. The barracks had been sealed for a reason. Vihan now understood. Someone, decades ago, had known what lived up there, had known and decided the best solution was containment. Don't destroy it. Don't confront it. Just wall it off and hope it stayed dormant. Vihan had broken that containment, had opened the door and let the shadows know the outside world still existed. And now they were awake, restless, pressed against their boundaries, testing for weaknesses. The hangar would never be fully renovated. Every contractor who entered would feel the wrongness, would find excuses to leave. The second level would remain sealed. The shadows would remain contained. And Bisbee Douglas International Airport would continue operating with a building that no one wanted to fully occupy. Some spaces are haunted not by who died there, but by what lived there. Fear is a powerful force, and when enough of it accumulates in one place over enough time, it stops being an emotion and becomes an entity, multiple entities, a colony of living shadows that feed on the residual terror soaked into every surface, that wait in the darkness for someone to disturb their rest. Vihan had disturbed them, had seen them, and now he carried that knowledge like a weight, understanding that some doors should never be opened, some seals should never be broken, and some darkness should never be exposed to light. You've been hiking for 2 hours when you realize the GPS is wrong. The coordinates you pulled from a military history forum were supposed to lead you to the Camp Horn Monument, a pyramid marking where over 13,000 troops trained for desert warfare in 1943. Instead, you're standing in the middle of nowhere, 6 miles west of a town called Hyder that barely exists anymore, surrounded by nothing but creosote bushes and heat shimmer. The monument should be visible from here. The forum post said it was 12 feet tall, impossible to miss against the flat desert landscape. But you see only emptiness stretching to the horizon in every direction. You check your phone. No signal which you expected. The battery is at 40%. The sun is directly overhead, pushing the temperature past 110 degrees. You have 2 bottles of water left. You decide to walk a grid pattern, covering ground systematically until you find something recognizable. North for 10 minutes, then east, then south, then west. Basic search technique. You mark your starting point with a cairn of 3 rocks and begin walking north. The ground crunches under your boots. Not just sand and gravel, but something else. You look down and see them. Rock-lined pathways, half buried by decades of wind-blown sand, running in straight lines across the desert. These are what remains of Camp Horn. The forum posts mentioned them, rock walkways that connected the various sections of the camp, the only structures that survived after everything else was removed in 1944. You feel a surge of satisfaction. You're in the right place after all. The monument must be nearby. You follow the rock line north. It runs perfectly straight for 100 yards, then turns 90 degrees east. You follow it east. After another 100 yards, it turns 90 degrees south. You follow it south, expecting it to lead somewhere. The monument, a foundation, anything. Instead, after 100 yards, it turns 90 degrees west. You stop. You've just walked a square, a perfect square, 100 yards per side. You can see your cairn from here, maybe 50 feet away. But something's wrong with the perspective. The cairn looks farther than it should, and the angle is off. You walk toward it, but after 20 steps you encounter another rock line. This one runs east-west, blocking your path. You don't remember crossing it on your way to the cairn. The heat is intense. You drink water and check your compass. North is north, east is east. Everything is oriented correctly. You step over the rock line and continue toward your cairn. 10 more steps and you hit another line, this one running north-south. You definitely didn't cross this before. You step over it. The cairn is gone. You're standing where it should be. You're certain of this, but the 3 rocks you stacked are nowhere in sight. You spin slowly, scanning the desert. Nothing. Just rock lines everywhere you look, forming a grid, pattern that extends in all directions. Walkways that connected buildings that no longer exist, laid out with military precision, perfectly preserved by the dry climate. You walk west, following a line that should lead back toward the road. After 50 yards, the line turns north. You follow it north. After 50 yards, it turns east. You follow it east, fighting down the first flutter of panic in your chest. This is wrong. Rock lines shouldn't form a maze. They're just remnants, static, unchanged for 80 years. They shouldn't be directing you in circles. You check your phone, still no signal, but the GPS works offline. According to the map, you're standing on agricultural land, former site of Camp Horn. The map shows you as a blue dot in open space. You mark a waypoint and walk in a straight line southeast toward the road. You don't follow the rock lines. You walk across them, over them, ignoring their grid pattern. After 5 minutes of walking straight, you look at your GPS. The blue dot has moved, but not southeast. It's moved in a square pattern, north, east, south, west, even though you walked in a straight line. That's impossible. GPS doesn't work that way. You restart your phone. Same result. The trail you've walked forms a perfect square. The panic isn't a flutter anymore. It's a steady pressure in your chest. You're lost. Not turned around lost, but fundamentally, impossibly lost. The desert looks the same in every direction. The rock lines extend everywhere, forming rectangles and squares. The ghost grid of a military camp that trained 13,000 soldiers for combat they'd never see in North Africa, because they ended up fighting in the Pacific instead. You pick a direction at random and walk. Don't think, don't plan, just move. Put distance between yourself and this spot. After 10 minutes, you stop, panting, and check your GPS. You've walked another square. The blue dot has traced north, east, south, west, returning almost to where you started. You've been moving for 10 minutes but gained maybe 30 yards of actual distance. The sun beats down. The heat is physical, pressing, making thought difficult. You drink more water. 1 bottle left now. The desert shimmers in the heat, and for a moment you see them. Tents. Hundreds of tents in neat rows, canvas shelters stretched across wooden frames forming a military encampment. You blink, and they're gone, but the image lingers. This is where they lived. Those 13,000 troops sleeping in tents in 110-degree heat, training for desert warfare in conditions that mimicked North Africa's Sahara. You walk faster, almost running now, following rock lines randomly, taking turns without pattern. North, south, east, west, it doesn't matter. You just need to get out, need to break free of this grid that shouldn't exist anymore, but somehow does. Somehow still enforces its military order on anyone who enters. Your GPS shows you've been walking for 30 minutes, covering maybe 100 yards. The battery is at 20%. You stop, hands on knees, trying to control your breathing. Think. Military camps have entrances. Camp Horn had an entrance. That's where the monument is, 12 feet of stone marking the spot where soldiers arrive to train. Find the entrance, find the monument, find the road. But which direction? The rock lines all look the same. There's no hierarchy, no main path versus side paths, just a uniform grid extending in every direction, the skeletal remains of a camp that covered enough area to house a division. 15,000 men at its peak, living in this geometric pattern, moving through this maze of walkways between their tents and the mess halls and the shower buildings and the outdoor theater where they watch movies under the desert stars. 7 of them died here. The monument lists their names. Soldiers of the 81st Infantry Division who didn't survive training. The forum post didn't say how they died. Training accidents, maybe. The heat, possibly. Desert training was brutal. Night maneuvers, live fire exercises, forced marches. Some men's bodies couldn't take it. Some men broke. You're breaking now. You can feel it happening. The heat, the dehydration, the impossible geometry of rock lines that guide you in endless squares. You sit down on one of the lines, the rocks warm through your pants, and try to think rationally. You have water. You have a phone. The battery won't last, but you can activate emergency beacon mode, send your location to rescue services. You try. The phone can't get signal to send. The GPS works, but communication doesn't. You're visible to satellites, but can't talk to them. The blue dot on your map sits in the middle of former Camp Horn, which the map shows as empty farmland, which reality shows as an endless grid of rock-lined walkways that trap anyone who enters. Movement in your peripheral vision. You turn your head slowly. Soldiers. Translucent, ghost images, walking the rock lines in formation. They wear 1943 uniforms and carry packs that must weigh 60 pounds in this heat. They march in perfect rows, following the grid, never deviating. You watch them pass, watch them turn 90 degrees at a corner, watch them continue marching. They don't see you, they're following orders even in death, even 80 years after the camp closed. You stand and follow them. If they're marching, they're going somewhere. Mess hall, parade ground, headquarters, somewhere. You trail behind the ghost formation, matching their pace, turning when they turn. North, east, south, west. They're walking a patrol pattern, you realize. Perimeter security, circling the camp boundaries. You're following a guard rotation that ended in 1944. You stop following them. You're thinking like they're real, like they know something you don't. They're dead. They're echoes. They can't help you. You're alone in a dead camp that refuses to stay. Dead. That still maintains its grid, that still traps the living in the same patterns that governed the dead. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows. You've been lost for 5 hours. Your last water bottle is half empty. Your phone is at 8%. The GPS shows you've walked 11 miles, but are less than 200 yards from where you started. Every path leads back to the center. Every direction is a square. The grid is inescapable. You find yourself walking the same rock line over and over, turning at the same corner, following the same path. You're marching now, keeping cadence like a soldier. Left, right. The heat isn't bothering you anymore. You're not thirsty. You're following orders, moving through the pattern, performing your duty in the endless training exercise that is Camp Horn. Your phone dies. The GPS disappears. The blue dot winks out. You're just boots on rock lines now, walking the grid. Another ghost in the formation. Behind you, more figures appear. 7 of them. The soldiers who died in training. They walk your path, follow your footsteps, welcome you to their eternal patrol. The monument is 12 feet away. You can see it now, the pyramidal stone marking the camp entrance. It's been there the whole time, just beyond the grid pattern, forever out of reach. The rock lines stop 100 feet short of it. The exit is visible but impossible to reach. You're trapped in the infrastructure, in the walkways, between buildings that no longer exist, following paths that lead only to more paths. You walk until dark, then you walk through the night. The grid glows faintly in the moonlight, rock lines marking your prison. By morning, you're indistinguishable from the other ghosts. Another soldier, training for a war that never ends, marching the perimeter of Camp Horn forever, unable to break free from the geometric order that still governs this place 80 years after the camp closed. Darren had been collecting minerals in Arizona for 12 years, and he prided himself on finding locations other rockhounds missed. The forum posts and guidebooks covered the obvious spots: the turquoise mines, the fire agate fields, the geode beds. But the real treasures were in the unmarked places, the forgotten sites where geology and history intersected in ways most people never noticed. Camp Beale Springs was one of those places. He'd found references to it buried in 1870s military records and surveyor's notes. A cavalry camp established in 1871 near a reliable desert spring, 12 adobe buildings including a 60-foot barracks, active for only a few years before being abandoned when the Hualapai people were forcibly relocated to the Colorado River Reservation in 1874. The exact location wasn't listed in any modern database, just vague references to near Kingman and Beale Wagon Road. He spent 3 weekends searching before he found it. The spring was the key. Water sources in the Arizona desert were limited, and a spring that had been reliable in 1871 would likely still be flowing. He hiked dirt roads north of Kingman, watching his topographic maps for the telltale green of vegetation that indicated water. When he found it, he knew immediately he was right. The spring emerged from fractured rock, creating a small pool maybe 6 feet across before the water disappeared into the sandy soil. Around it, partially buried by 153 years of windblown sand, were the remains of adobe structures. Not much. Low mounds that might have been walls, stone foundations, a few intact corners where the adobe had been protected from the weather, but unmistakably human-made, unmistakably old. Darren set up his camera and began documenting. This was significant. A military installation from the Indian Wars era that hadn't been cataloged by modern historians. The spring itself was beautiful, clear water reflecting the sky, surrounded by ferns and grasses that seemed impossibly green against the desert landscape. He filled his water bottles from it, the water cold and pure and tasting faintly of minerals. That's when he saw the artifacts. Not minerals, but something better. Remnants of human occupation. A rusted horseshoe half buried near the spring. What might have been a button from a military uniform. Fragments of pottery that looked Native American in origin, much older than the camp itself. This had been a sacred place before the army arrived, Darren realized. A water source used by indigenous peoples for centuries, then claimed by the military, then abandoned, then forgotten. He collected samples of everything. Rocks from the spring, soil from the foundations. One small pottery shard that was already loose and would have eroded away in the next monsoon season. He told himself he was preserving history, documenting an important site. The pottery fragment was particularly beautiful, decorated with a geometric pattern in red and black. He wrapped it carefully in cloth and placed it in his backpack. The drive home to Phoenix took 3 hours. Darren spent it planning his research. He'd cross-reference the pottery style with known Hualapai artifacts, submit his GPS coordinates to the Historical Society, maybe write an article for one of the archaeology journals. This could be significant. This could get him cited. He didn't notice the figure in his rearview mirror until he was on the highway. A person sitting in his back seat, visible only as a dark shape when he glanced at the mirror, but somehow absent when he turned his head to look directly. Darren's rational mind said it was just shadows, just the headrest and seatbelt creating shapes in his peripheral vision. But the shape was too consistent, too human proportioned. By the time he reached home, the presence in the back seat felt undeniable. Not threatening, but there, watching. Darren carried his backpack inside quickly, telling himself he was tired, that the long day of hiking had exhausted him more than he realized. He unpacked his samples onto his workbench, arranged them in neat rows, photographed each one with his high-resolution camera. The pottery shard was last. Under his desk lamp, the geometric pattern was even more intricate than he'd realized. The red and black lines formed interlocking spirals, traditional Hualapai design elements. This was old, maybe 1860s or earlier. A piece of someone's life, someone's art, someone's daily existence. Darren went to bed around midnight, his mind still processing the day's discovery. He dreamed of water, the spring, clear and cold, surrounded by people he somehow knew were Hualapai. They were gathered around it, families and elders, filling containers, talking softly. The spring was the center of their seasonal movements, a reliable source in the harsh desert. Then soldiers arrived, blue uniforms and rifles, and the people were pushed away from the water they'd used for generations. The dream shifted, and he saw the adobe buildings being constructed, the spring enclosed by the military camp, forbidden territory. He woke at 3 a.m. to find someone standing beside his bed. Not a shadow this time, but a fully formed figure. A young Hualapai man, maybe 20 years old, wearing traditional clothing that dated to the 1870s. His expression wasn't angry or frightening. It was sad. Profoundly, unbearably sad. He looked at Darren with eyes that held more grief than any person should carry. Darren tried to speak but couldn't make sound. The figure didn't move, didn't threaten, just stood there radiating sorrow so intense it was physically painful. Then he pointed toward Darren's office, toward where the pottery shard lay on the workbench. The gesture was clear. That belongs to us. You took something sacred. The figure faded, but the sadness remained, hanging in the air like smoke. Darren lay awake until dawn, unable to shake the weight of what he'd felt. That wasn't just grief, it was betrayal, the kind of betrayal that comes from having everything taken away, from being forcibly removed from your homeland, from watching sacred places become military installations, and then ruins, and then forgotten. He researched obsessively the next day. Camp Beale Springs had been established in 1871 by Captain Thomas Brine with 12 adobe buildings. The Hualapai Indian Agency was housed there starting in 1873. In 1824, the Hualapai people were forced to relocate to the Colorado River Reservation, marched away from their traditional lands. Many died during the relocation. Many more died from disease and despair at the reservation. By 1835, most had escaped and returned to their homeland, but the damage was done. A way of life had been destroyed. The figure appeared again that night, and the next night, and the next. Always the same young man, always with that expression of grief and betrayal, always pointing towards the pottery shard. He never spoke, never touched anything, never acted threatening. He was just there, a constant presence that filled Darren's home with sorrow. Darren tried explaining out loud that he was a researcher, that he was preserving history, that the pottery would have eroded away if he hadn't collected it. The figure just looked at him, and in that look, Darren understood how hollow his justifications were. This wasn't about preservation. This was about taking. Taking water, taking land, taking artifacts, taking everything from people who had called this place home for centuries. Sleep became impossible. The grief that emanated from the figure was too intense, too consuming. Darren would lie in bed, feeling the weight of displacement, of forced relocation, of watching your people die from policies designed to destroy your culture. It wasn't his grief. He was experiencing someone else's emotional memory, but that didn't make it less real. By the end of the first week, Darren looked gaunt. His coworkers asked if he was sick. His hand shook when he tried to work. The figure followed him everywhere now, to his car, to the office, to the grocery store, always at the edge of his vision, always radiating that profound sadness. Other people couldn't see him, but Darren could feel everyone unconsciously moving away, sensing something wrong even if they couldn't identify what. He tried returning the pottery shard, drove back to Camp Beale Springs, hiked to the spring, placed the fragment exactly where he'd found it. The figure watched from beside the spring, his expression unchanged. Darren apologized, explained he hadn't understood, promised he'd never disturb the site again. The figure remained, because it wasn't about the pottery. Darren understood this as he knelt beside the spring, surrounded by ruins of a military camp that had displaced indigenous people from their sacred water source. The figure wasn't haunting him personally. He was a conduit, a witness, someone had to carry the grief, had to feel the betrayal, had to understand what had been lost when the cavalry arrived and claimed this spring in 1871. The figure followed him home, followed him to work, followed him through his daily life, a constant reminder of historical trauma that most people never thought about. The WWII had been forced from their land. Their people had died. Their sacred sites had been turned into military installations and then abandoned and then forgotten. And now someone had to remember. Someone had to carry that grief forward. Darren stopped sleeping, stopped eating regularly. His life became a waking memorial to people he'd never met, to injustices he hadn't committed but benefited from nonetheless. The figure was always there, silent witness to everything the American West had been built upon: displacement, broken treaties, sacred places desecrated and forgotten. After 3 weeks, Darren quit his job. After 4 weeks, he sold his house. He couldn't live with the weight anymore, couldn't function under the constant pressure of someone else's grief. He moved away from Arizona entirely, drove east until he couldn't drive anymore, settled in a small town in Ohio where desert and cavalry camps and sacred springs didn't exist. The figure came with him. Of course he did, because grief like that doesn't respect geography. It transcends location, transcends time, transcends everything except the need to be witnessed. The WWII had lost their homeland, but their loss would never be forgotten as long as Darren lived. He would carry it, feel it, embody it until he died. He never collected minerals again, never hiked to forgotten sites, never disturbed historical locations. He lived a quiet life, marked by profound sadness that everyone around him could feel, but nobody could explain. People avoided him without knowing why. He became a ghost himself, haunted by someone else's history, someone else's trauma, someone else's loss. Camp Beale Springs remains unmarked, its exact location still not listed in any modern database. The spring still flows, surrounded by ruins that few people can find. It's better that way. Some places should stay forgotten, not because their history is unimportant, but because their importance is too great. Some losses are too profound to be reduced to artifact collections and research papers. Some grief should be left where it lies, undisturbed, sacred in its sorrow. You shouldn't be here after dark. That's what the Post historian told you when he handed over the keys to Carlton House, the oldest building at Fort Huachuca. I can give you access until 1900 hours, he said, checking his watch. But you need to be out before sunset. Trust me on this one. You nodded, assured him you'd be done by 6 p.m., and thanked him for the unusual accommodation. Most active military bases don't grant civilian researchers after-hours access to historic buildings, but your credentials were solid, and your book on Buffalo Soldier regiments at southwestern forts had earned you enough credibility to open doors. It's 7:42 p.m. now. The sun set 20 minutes ago, and you're still inside Carlton House, surrounded by 148 years of military history. The building was constructed in 1877, when Fort Huachuca was established to counter the Chiricahua Apache threat. It served as both officers' quarters and hospital, witnessed Geronimo's surrender campaign in 1886, housed Buffalo soldiers from 1913 to 1933, and survived when countless other frontier forts were demolished and forgotten. The walls have absorbed more history than most museums will ever display. You meant to leave on time. You planned to leave on time. But the archives in the second-floor room were more extensive than expected. Handwritten medical logs from the 1880s, photographs of officers and their families, personal letters that should have been removed decades ago but somehow remained. You've been photographing documents for 3 hours, each one more fascinating than the last, and you didn't notice the sun setting until the light through the windows shifted from gold to purple to black. The overhead lights work, but they're dim and spaced far apart, leaving pools of shadow between them. The building is silent, in a way modern structures never are. No HVAC hum, no electrical buzz, just the occasional creak of old wood settling and the whisper of wind through gaps in the window frames. You gather your camera and laptop, preparing to leave, when you hear footsteps on the floor above you, measured footsteps. The distinctive click of hard-soled shoes on wooden floorboards. Someone is walking the length of the second floor, from the east end to the west, then back again. You freeze, listening. The building should be empty. The post historian locked you in, gave you the interior keys to access the archive rooms, and told you to call his cell when you were ready to leave so he could come unlock the exterior door. Nobody else should have access. Hello? Your voice sounds too loud in the silence. The footsteps stop. You wait, heart pounding, then rationalize. Old buildings make sounds. Wood expands and contracts. Pipes settle. You're hearing normal structural noise, not footsteps. You're a researcher, a historian, a person who deals in facts and evidence. You don't believe in ghosts. The footsteps resume, faster now, as if whoever is walking has quickened their pace. They cross, directly over your head, and you can track the movement across the ceiling. East to west, pause. West to east, pause. The pattern of someone pacing, someone agitated, someone who cannot settle. You should leave. Call the post historian, get out, come back during daylight hours. But your curiosity is stronger than your apprehension, and you're already climbing the stairs to the second floor, camera in one hand and your phone's flashlight in the other. The historian had mentioned that Carlton House was rumored to be haunted. Soldiers have reported strange things over the years, he'd said with a dismissive laugh. But you'd filed that under superstition and ignored it. The second floor is darker than the first. Only 2 of the overhead lights work up here, casting weak yellow illumination across a hallway lined with doors. The footsteps have stopped again. You walk slowly down the hall, checking each room. Most are empty, stripped of furniture, showing only bare walls and wooden floors. But at the far end, in the room that your research indicates was once part of the hospital ward, you see her. A woman stands with her back to you, wearing a long dress from the 1880s or 1890s, her hair pinned up in the style of that era. She's looking out the window at the parade ground below, her posture rigid, hands clasped in front of her. You can see through her. Not completely, but enough to know she isn't solid, isn't real in the conventional sense. Your rational mind stutters, trying to categorize what you're seeing in terms that make sense. Charlotte. You don't know why you say the name. It simply comes to you, arriving in your consciousness as a certainty. This is Charlotte, and she's been waiting in Carlton House for over a century. She turns, and her face is both beautiful and terrible. Young, maybe 30, with features that would have been called handsome in the Victorian era. But her expression carries the weight of immense suffering, and her eyes, translucent like the rest of her, hold something that makes you step backward involuntarily. Knowledge. The kind of knowledge that destroys innocence. You can see me. Her voice isn't heard so much as felt, resonating in your chest rather than your ears. They usually can't. The soldiers who work here sometimes sense me, but they don't see. You're different. You want to run. Every survival instinct is screaming at you to leave this building, this base, possibly this state. But your researcher's mind is stronger, and you find yourself nodding. I can see you. Are you Charlotte? Charlotte Brennan. I was the post surgeon's wife from 1883 to 1891. This was our home. She gestures around the room, and for a moment you see it as it was, furnished, lived in, warm. Then the vision fades, leaving only the bare room. And it became my prison. You should document this, should record video, take photographs, gather evidence of what you're experiencing, but your hands are shaking too much to hold your camera steady, and some part of you understands that technology won't capture her anyway. This isn't the kind of haunting that shows up on film. What happened to you? The question emerges without planning, but Charlotte's expression suggests she's been waiting decades for someone to ask. My husband was a brilliant surgeon, too brilliant, too curious. The Army sent him soldiers with diseases and injuries that conventional medicine couldn't treat. Men dying slowly from consumption, from blood poisoning, from wounds that wouldn't heal. He wanted to help them, wanted to advance medical science, wanted to be remembered as the man who found cures. Her face contorts with remembered anguish. He needed test subjects, living subjects, and I was the most convenient. The temperature drops 20 degrees in seconds. Your breath mists, and the shadows in the room deepen, pressing closer. Charlotte continues, her voice growing stronger, more urgent, as if she's been holding this story for so long that now it must be told all at once. He started with small experiments, testing anesthetics, pain responses, how long consciousness could be maintained under various conditions. He told me it was for the soldiers, that I was helping save lives. I believed him because he was my husband, because I loved him, because women in 1885 didn't question their husband's medical expertise. She moves toward you, and though she's transparent, her presence is overwhelming. Then the experiments became worse. He wanted to understand pain, to map it, to discover its limits. He used me because I couldn't refuse, couldn't report him, couldn't escape. For 6 years, he conducted medical experiments in this room, while Fort Huachuca went about its business outside. You're crying without realizing it, tears streaming down your face as Charlotte's story pours into you. Not just words, but emotions, memories, the visceral experience of being trapped, being hurt, being used by someone who was supposed to protect you. I died here in 1891. Officially, it was consumption. Nobody questioned it. Wives died of consumption all the time on frontier posts. They buried me with full honors, and my husband continued his career, eventually becoming one of the Army's most respected surgeons. His papers are probably in the archives you were reading. Her translucent hand points toward the stairs, toward the first floor where you'd spent the afternoon photographing documents. I need someone to know the truth. I need someone to write what really happened in Carlton House, in this room where officers' wives were supposed to be safe, but where one woman was systematically destroyed by medical experimentation masked as marriage. Charlotte's form is fading now, becoming more transparent, but her voice remains clear. Will you tell my story? Will you give me what he never did? Acknowledgement, truth, a voice. You nod, unable to speak, still crying. Charlotte smiles, and for the first time her expression holds something other than suffering, relief. After 134 years, someone finally knows. Someone finally believes. Someone finally bears witness to what happened in this room. Thank you. Her voice is barely a whisper now. I can rest now, but remember, institutional authority often hides institutional abuse. Question the official records. Look deeper. The truth is usually buried beneath laudatory eulogies and impressive credentials. She's almost completely gone now, just a shimmer in the air. Tell them Charlotte Brennan existed. Tell them I mattered. Tell them what was done to me in the name of medical progress. She vanishes completely, leaving you alone in the dark room. The temperature returns to normal. The oppressive weight lifts. You stand there for long minutes, processing what you've experienced, what you've been entrusted with. Then you go downstairs, gather your research materials, and call the post historian to unlock the door. You don't mention Charlotte. Don't mention the story she told you. You simply thank him, drive to your hotel, and spend the entire night researching medical practices at frontier army posts in the 1880s and 1890s. What you find is disturbing. Official documents that mention experimental treatments, medical journals that discuss voluntary subjects in language that makes clear consent was neither informed nor freely given, laudatory obituaries for Army surgeons that gloss over methods and focus on results. Charlotte Brennan's name appears in exactly 3 documents: a marriage record from 1883, a death certificate from 1891 listing consumption as cause of death, and a property transfer when her husband left Fort Huachuca in 1892. That's all. 3 mentions, then historical oblivion. But between those lines, in the medical records and experimental treatment logs, you begin to piece together what happened in Carlton House during those 6 years. Your book, when published 2 years later, includes a chapter on medical ethics at frontier posts. You don't claim Charlotte's ghost told you her story. Academic credibility has its limits, but you document everything you can verify through historical records, and you dedicate the chapter to Charlotte Brennan, 1860-1891, whose story deserves to be told. It's the most you can do. It's what she asked for. Fort Huachuca remains an active military installation, and Carlton House still stands as its oldest building. But after your research is published, the base begins acknowledging the darker aspects of its history alongside the celebrated ones. Charlotte's story becomes part of the official narrative, taught to new officers as a lesson in ethics and authority, and the importance of questioning even respected institutions. You return to Carlton House 5 years after that first visit. The post historian, a different one now, gives you daytime access, and you spend hours in the second-floor room where you met Charlotte. It feels different now, lighter. The oppressive weight is gone, replaced by simple historical presence. She kept her word. She's resting, but her story lives on, told and retold, ensuring that what happened in this room will never be forgotten, will never happen again, will always serve as a reminder that history's ghosts often have truths to tell if someone is willing to listen,